Okay, so we're going to begin. So everybody, welcome to a special ISGAP seminar. Today we have really the honor and the privilege to host two incredible individuals, a scholar and a human rights activist. Everybody I'm sure on Zoom knows Natan Sharansky. Natan and Gil Troy recently published a very important book entitled Never Alone, Prison Politics and My People. And that will be the theme of today's event. And before I introduce the two speakers, I wanted to just say, I hope you all have a happy and healthy new year and enjoy the holidays. This is an important week in our calendar, and it's fitting that we're going to be examining some of the issues today with two esteemed guests. So everybody knows Natan Sharansky. Natan, as you know, was a political prisoner in the former Soviet Union, and he served in 4 Israeli governments as a cabinet minister. He's the sole living non-US citizen to receive both the Congressional Gold Medal, which he received in 1986, and the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which was awarded to him in 2006. Natan won the 2018 Israel Prize for exceptional contributions to the State of Israel, and he was the winner of the 2020 Genesis Prize for outstanding professional achievement, contribution to humanity, and a commitment to Jewish values. He lives in Jerusalem with his wife Avital. He has 2 daughters, 2 children, and 7 grandchildren. Professor Gil Troy, who is also joining us today, is a distinguished scholar of North American history. He's a professor at McGill University. He's the author of 9 books on American presidencies and 3 books on issues of Zionism. He recently designated an Allgemeiner as a top 100 Jewish people of positive influence for enhancing Jewish life. Gil has appeared as a featured commentator on CNN, on many documentaries on CNN such as the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s that was played during the past year. He lives in Jerusalem with his wife Linda, and they have 4 children. And I think any scholar that can find a way to live in 2 great cities like Jerusalem and Montreal must be doing something right. So it's really a privilege to have you both here. And the format of today's event is that Natan and Gil will address us for roughly 20 to 35 minutes, somewhere in there. And then I'll ask a few questions, we can have a conversation. And then the people who are listening, you're very welcome to email me your questions, and I'll try to get as many of your questions into the conversation. So without further ado, Natan and Gil, thank you so much for being here. And I should say, very importantly to my colleagues and I, Natan is the chair of ISGAP, which is a wonderful honor for us. And Gil was one of the first professors that actually joined ISGAP many years ago when we were just starting. So it's a pleasure to have you both. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Shana Tova. Gil, you want to start? You want to?
I thought you were going to start about the issue of fear and how it seems to be growing on campus and in the world today, before we get into the issue of anti-Semitism.
Okay. As some of you know, immediately after the prison, I wrote my memoir about the prison, which is called Fear No Evil. And so the question is, why now, so many years after, I go back to this, after all, our book, Never Alone, is about 9 years in prison, 9 years in the Israeli government, 9 years as the head of Jewish agency. And well, at least sort of this book is going back to Soviet Union, to the years of communism, to prison, and to fear which controlled the life of Soviet Union. Why I thought it is relevant, important today? Because we see this phenomena in some strange way coming back to the free world. But so first of all, let's remind ourselves, what was communism about? Communism was, communist regime, Soviet Union was the most powerful dictatorship in the world, which controlled almost 1/3 of the world, and it controlled the life of 200 million people, the life and the brains of 200 million people. How? Under the pretext of creating society of equals, it was simply destroying, killing millions and then tens of millions of people in order to create society without identity, society where people are afraid to feel solidarity with their nation, where people have no religion other than communist religion, and where all the property belongs to the state, and the state will decide how to distribute it equally among the citizens. And in the beginning, they had to kill a lot of people in order to overcome the resistance. But with the time, they don't need it. It's enough that people are living constantly with fear. I remember I first started the life of loyal Soviet citizen when I was 5 years old. Stalin died, and my father explains to me, 5 years old boy, that it is very good for us, for Jews, that Stalin died. We were, as Jews, in big danger, and now we are safe. Remember all your life that miracle happened at the moment of highest danger. Stalin died. But he said, don't say to anybody, do what everybody does. And I go back to kindergarten, and I sing together with all the children about the great leader and the son of all the world, Stalin. And I cry together with all children, and I have no idea who of these children is crying really, and who is crying because their fathers told them to cry. And that is the typical life of Soviet citizen. When you have your strong beliefs, you have your dreams, you know the truth, but the truth is only for your family. Publicly, you live constantly in the situation of self-censorship. You're saying things which are permitted, or you know that authorities will not be against what you said. You read only the books which are permitted, and so on and so on. And this life of doublethink was extremely uncomfortable. And only when you have strength to throw it away, you feel what is real, what is freedom. And I found this strength to throw away my fear only when I discovered my identity, discovered Israel, discovered Jewish family. This discovery is a very powerful process which empowers you, and then you can finally say what you really think. And it was such a powerful feeling of relief that then when I became a dissident and later found myself in prison, and KGB constantly proposed me in exchange for my life to extract from me statements that they are right and I'm wrong. I knew that what they really tried to do is take me back to this life of doublethink, of slave. And I didn't want to be slave out of prison. I preferred to be free person in prison. Why it was very important to describe all this and to take us back to the realities of the communism? Because many years after this, very surprisingly, in fact, in the beginning, 2003 or 4, for the first time, I discovered at the time of Second Intifada, when Israel was in the middle of the struggle against terrorism, and at the same time there was huge campaign against Israel in the free world, organized, of course, by Palestinian terrorists and those who wanted to destroy our state. And suddenly I see how a number of students are telling me that though they sympathize fully and they want to sign letter in support of Israel, but they are afraid that it will damage their career. And that's why they decided to take very passive stand and not, for a few years until their career is not defined, not to express publicly their sympathy to Israel. And I thought, my God, it's not in Moscow University. It's in Harvard, in Cambridge, in Columbia, in Rutgers. So that was like a very strange deja vu. And so that's why in the book we speak a lot about doublethink and fear under communism, and doublethink coming back step by step into our daily life in the free world.
So the important nuance here is that it's not just that we're fighting the anti-Semites, the anti-Zionists, the Jewish anti-Semites, the Jewish anti-Zionists, but we're talking about what we call the Ivy League double thinkers. Can you imagine how demoralizing it must have been for Natan to get on that campus and discover the best and the brightest in the top universities across the United States having this fear of what we now call the cancel culture. And before we get to the cancel culture, which I think is sort of the part of the atmospherics that you have to deal with when we talk about fighting anti-Semitism, just let me go a little bit more into this freedom from fear, which fascinates me, obviously, as an American historian. One of Franklin Roosevelt's fundamental four freedoms. He spoke of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And as Charles so kindly said in his warm introduction, and it's a pleasure to be with you again, Charles, after all these years, and I salute so much of what you guys are doing. I'm an American historian. I usually write alone, and I usually write about dead presidents. And this collaboration was a unique opportunity to try to take our vision. And we had lots of fights over wording and over structure, but we ideologically were remarkably on the same page, despite my being born in freedom and Natan being born in what he called that slavery of the Soviet Union. So we wanted to take our ideas and use Natan's life story to tell it in a more user-friendly and dramatic way. So people keep on calling this a memoir. We call it a memoir festo. It's kind of a manifesto / memoir. And so it also wasn't the kind of thing that I did conventional research for. But there were two moments of research in the book which really gave me the chills that I wanted to share with you that reinforce Natan's point. First, I read this article in the New York Times Magazine from 1984 by Victor Krasin. Is that the name? Is that the way we pronounce this? Soviet dissident who endured the same KGB interrogation.
Krasin. Victor Krasin.
He was a dissident. Natan famously tells the story about his interrogator constantly telling him, look, Victor Krasin gave up. He stopped being a dissident. He confessed. And look, he went on to freedom. And Natan looks back at him and says, well, he had to have one press conference in which he confessed, and a second press conference once he reached freedom in which he confessed about the confession. He says, I'm going to save time and not have that. So I'm reading this account, and what was chilling was two things. One was he describes the exact same KGB interrogation techniques, and ultimately they cracked him. They broke him, but you see that Natan refused to be broken. And one of the things that Natan explains is that part of the reason why, obviously a lot has to do with Natan's psychological makeup, but it also had to do with the fact that he was part of a community, that he knew that he wasn't just this lone individual, but he was, in the theme of the book, never alone, that he was supported by the Jewish people, that he was part of this narrative, that he was what he also calls the interconnectedness of souls. He felt that sense of obligation, that sense of network. And I think that's one of the powerful glues that both feeds the anti-Semites, feeds the haters, but also makes us very strong in resisting. But the second thing was that Krasin talks again and again about fear. When he describes becoming a dissident, he talks about stepping out of the fear, freeing himself from fear. And then he talks about succumbing to the fear. And when he remembers his first press conference, he says, this is his language, he says, I was empty. Because he had returned to fear. He'd returned exactly what Natan said, to doublethink. But still, I'm thinking, okay, maybe this is just a Soviet Union game. And we're talking about fear constantly. And I pick up a book that's an edited collection of memoirs of the Arab Spring. And again, goosebumps moment, because you read an account in Egypt, in Yemen, in Libya, of individuals who don't know Natan Sharansky, who don't know the story of the Soviet Jews, who don't know what was going on there, who live on the other side of the world in a very different culture. And when they talk about that moment that they finally felt free, it's freedom from fear. And of course, when we talk about the great failure in the Oslo peace process and the biggest ongoing problems with the Palestinians, we talk about how Yasser Arafat and his terrorist dictators came and imposed a regime of fear on those people. So one of the things I learned from this book was the power of fear and I always took what Natan said kind of as a talking point, that, oh, it's a universal process. But really through reading about this account of a Soviet dissident and reading about this account of the Arab dissidents, I realized it truly is a universal process. It's not just something that they cooked up in their minds, the Refuseniks and Andrei Sakharov and those extraordinary heroes from the Soviet Union, but it was really this important insight that I think now leaps into the conversation we have to have today about a cancel culture, about a poll that we found where the Cato Institute, CATO, found that 62% of Americans today, left and right, liberals and conservatives, report that they often self-censor, report that they often fear expressing their political opinion. And of course, we should emphasize, you can love Donald Trump, you can hate Donald Trump, America remains a free republic. This isn't a fear that's coming from above. This is a fear that's coming from below. This is a fear of consequences at work, consequences among friends, being Twitter shamed. And before we get to the fight against anti-Semitism, I felt it was important, and Natan felt it was important, that we talk about some of the underbrush, some of the atmospherics that make it so hard for us to fight our good fight and for you to lead in this good fight, because we're really in a situation where people know the right thing to do. And that's truly un-American and truly undemocratic and truly un-Western.
Okay, now let's go to anti-Semitism itself. And I think what makes it, and of course, in the third part of our book, and also a little bit in the second, we write a lot about fighting anti-Semitism today. And something about, because we are speaking all the time about unity of Jewish people, anti-Semitism is the easiest topic. It's always united us for 1,000 years. Whenever there was Damascus blood libel or Dreyfus trial or Bailey's case in Ukraine, Tsarist Russia. Well, for Jews, it was so clear that it's against them and they have to be united. Today, we have a very unique situation. We have, at the same time, rise of anti-Semitism on the left and the right. And in our very, very polarized world, for people, it is very difficult to recognize that there is anti-Semitism in their own political camp. And it is very easy for them to attack anti-Semitism in the most extreme terms of their political opponents. And the problem is that it doesn't help. Because after all, if you criticize your political opponents, they want it. It's only good for their election among their turf. The challenge is how to see anti-Semitism among ourselves. And that was a challenge for me as a minister in Israel government, when almost 20 years ago, I was responsible for confronting among the other things, of anti-Semitism. And I discovered that whenever we are speaking about anti-Semitism against Israel, I'm told again and again, that's legitimate criticism of Israel. And that's when I had really to find some criteria, how we will divide between legitimate criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. And that's when I came with my 3D criteria: demonization, delegitimization, and double standard towards Jews. These are the weapons which were used against Jews for thousands of years. So today, when there is clear demonization of Israel, when Israel is compared with Auschwitz, for example, one of many, or when there is delegitimization of Israel, when the right of Israel to exist is questioned, or when there is clear double standard which is applied to our country, which is not applied to any other country, boycott of Israel, for example. These are tools of anti-Semitism, but this time against collective Jews. And we have, and in this book, that's what we are doing. We go back and forth to the demonization, the legitimization, double standard towards Jews and towards Israel. And that is becoming stronger. And there are more new phenomena of hatred towards Jews, and which finishes sometimes very tragically on the right, and unprecedented campaigns, really anti-Semitic campaigns of delegitimizing and boycotting Israel on the left, and how it is important that we will see anti-Semitism among in our political camp. Gil?
So indeed, the book is thirds. The first third is about 9 years in the Soviet Union and the Soviet, 9 years in the Gulag. Then the second 9 years is 9 years in Israeli politics, where, again, Natan has to start fighting anti-Semitism and this Ivy League doublethink, as we call it. And the third part is his 9 years in the Jewish Agency. And that's where we started dealing with the issues of identity building and anti-Semitism. And we thought we'd make this, rather than a conversation, we'd get a little literary and make this a literary reading. And take 3 short paragraphs from the book that really get to the heart of this insane debate that's going on right now between what's worse, left-wing anti-Semitism or right-wing anti-Semitism. So, if I may, hate is hate. I despise this insulting, distracting, myopic new fight about whether left-wing anti-Semitism or right-wing anti-Semitism is worse. I can't think of a more intellectually hollow, morally shallow, pointless debate today. No one cares that the disgraced Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein supported liberal causes. His sexism was quite literally criminal. No one asks if a racist is right-wing or left-wing. If you mistreat or prejudge African Americans, you're a racist, period. In the swamps of hatred, the mud doesn't change colors. It's neither Republican red nor Democratic blue. Selective indignation undermines the righteousness of indignation, and it emboldens the haters. From up close, when you're experiencing Jew hatred, it looks and feels the same, regardless of the hater's background or affiliation, which is why left has to fight left and right has to fight right. And then we give examples. Consider these recent Jew-hating incidents. Did a left-winger or a right-winger tweet out the sick riddle asking, what's the difference between a Jew and a pizza? The pizza leaves the oven. Who was guilty of abusing a young Jewish politician in California with cries of, fire up the oven? Who photoshopped the face of a Jewish journalist onto the body of an Auschwitz prisoner? Who made a mock album cover for Set Fire to the Jews with a distorted picture of the singer Adele as Adelef Hitler? And who knocked the kippah off a 14-year-old's head in Brooklyn? Ultimately, hate is hate. So the answer is the first tweeter was a left-wing BDS supporter. They claim they're only anti-Zionist, but clearly they're anti-Semitic. The second online bully against the California politician was a neo-Nazi. The third was an inflamed far-right Trump supporter. The fourth was a Student for Justice in Palestine activist. And the fifth was just a hoodlum. And that's our challenge, having very clear lines, fighting the left's demonization, delegitimization, double standard, fighting the right's use of historic libels, of historic images, of their attack on halakha, their claim that Jews are seeking hegemony, and saying enough. And that's, of course, where you guys come in, because you've been so effective in transcending the ugly partisanship of today and drawing those very clear red lines against hatred. And of course, Charles, I want to acknowledge your background in having fought the apartheid regime, and Natan's background also as true human rights activists. And we recognize that this isn't just a Jewish issue, that it's a broader issue. And we also call for what I like to call the Jiu-Jitsu, J-E-W, that we're not just anti-Semites, that the true vision is a positive democratic, lowercase d, democratic vision when we talk about freedom. When we talk about identity, when we talk about Zionism, we are not just fighting the hatred, but we're talking about a positive identity. And that balance of identity and freedom, of liberalism and nationalism, of a constructive approach to life is so important, especially for our students on campus, that not just be negative and not just be defensive and not just be reactive, but we have a positive vision of identity and freedom, of a Zionism, which is about finding meaning. I also like to call this Pilates, Judaism and Zionism, where we build up our core and from there we fight effectively. And that, of course, is one of the themes, of course, of Yom Kippur, going deep inside and strengthening ourselves so we have enough power for the coming year ahead to fight for identity and fight for freedom, but also delight in our identity and delight in our freedom. Charles, now to you.
Well said. Well said. So thank you both very much. And you know, the book is very important. We just Ira posted it on the chat. You can see, you can order your copies now. It's a very important book, and I think it takes the incredible experience of Natan and his life's work, and I think you kind of take all that richness and apply it to understanding some of the questions and issues today. So I would like to start off by saying that actually I saw a post of yours yesterday on Facebook. I'm not really on Facebook very much, but I saw, Gil, that you posted how Natan started a hunger strike when he was in prison in 1982. And Natan, you started it on the eve of Yom Kippur because you intentionally started that so you can sort of feel connected to the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, and that would give you extra strength for the struggles that you were facing. And you know, also in addition to being engaged in the anti-apartheid movement, I was the chairperson of the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry at McGill Hillel. And I went to the Soviet Union in 1983, and Natan, you were on a hunger strike again during that time. And I met your mother and brother. They came into Moscow. They were in internal exile, and they came to meet Stephen Singerman from Hillel and some friends and colleagues and leaders of the Refusnik movement. And there's something very deep. So also I was fortunate to grow up in a family and a community that really taught us that if you put anything higher than God or anything higher, I think, than the Jewish people, it's a form of idolatry, that we're part of a nation. We have to be connected to Israel and to God, and anything, if it's money or letters next to your name or prestige, that this is a form of idolatry, and we have to be, you know, connected to our real beliefs and wisdom. And in a sense, I remember my grandparents, my parents, my sister, our entire community were fighting for the Soviet Jews in Montreal and in other places. And my thinking as a kid was, and we started doing this when I was probably 7 or 8 years old at USY and then in Chambly, Laval, that I knew that if my grandparents immigrated east instead of west, that I could have been in your situation, and that we had this very strong affinity to the Jewish community in the former Soviet Union. And we were the lucky Jews helping the imprisoned Jews. And now I find it incredible. You know, thank God the Soviet Jews were free to do what they want now, and they immigrated to Israel. And Natan, thank God you became a leader of the Jewish people in our homeland in Israel. It's an incredible story. But there's something very, it's almost like a nightmare to hear Gil, you know, a fellow North American Montreal Jewish person, writing about doublethink at our finest institutions in our lifetime in 2020. And the fact that, Natan, you coming from a community that needed the help of world Jewry, you're now coming to help us. And this doublethink is powerful. Even last week, I was asked to participate in a conference on the IRA definition of anti-Semitism by CAM. And I wasn't asked to attend as an expert. I was asked to explain a situation that happened to me at Oxford University. And I did it, but I was nervous and I was a little bit intimidated because I'm putting my neck out on the line and I'm telling the Jewish world what happens at some of these finest universities, what happened to me at Oxford among my colleagues. And it's, we have to dig deep and fight. And I'm struggling against anti-Semitism, but my colleagues, other faculty, and particularly students are really facing, as Gil referred to, this doublethink on anti-Semitism. And it's now politically incorrect to be strong in your Jewish identity, even though we're rooted in human rights and we try to further democratic principles, and to be a Zionist, to believe that we have the right to self-determination in our homeland. So Natan, what I'm trying to say is, how, given your experience, and now you're sort of coming to help kids on Western European and North American campuses, what are your insights to our community? Because I think our community is a little bit afraid, divided. We don't know exactly how to place our feet on the ground and fight back. And in this moment between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, as Gil said, when we have to kind of look within and become stronger as individuals and our connection to our heritage. What are your insights to this kind of precarious moment that North American Jewry finds itself in for the first time in generations?
I don't want to pretend. We don't try to pretend that we are great teachers of the generation. We share our experience and we analyze the things from different perspectives and try to explain to understand what are the roots and what are the tools which we have. So Soviet Jewry movement was really absolutely unique laboratory because it's united all types of Jews. They were human rights activists who came straight from marching with Martin Luther King, and we were marching. Student struggle for Jewry was created exactly like this, and then continued from civil rights marches to these marches. And there were Orthodox Jews who believed that is the biggest mitzvah, saving the other Jew. And so they were religious and secular. They were French communists and British aristocrats. There were all types of Jews and non-Jews who were involved in this struggle. And it seems like unity, the highest moment of unity of Jewish people, and we write about it, that in fact, then, what's not known, there were many different organizations who were competing with one another, who couldn't stand one another, who were accusing the other group in betrayal of our mutual struggle. And I, as a spokesman of our movement, had to know how to work with all of them. And then they saw that all of them, and the same list of KGB file as anti-Soviet organizations. For KGB, for Soviet Union, there was no difference. And in fact, for the success of our struggle, it was very good that there were all types of Jews who participated, because that what gave us opportunity to reach everybody, to reach establishment and activists, left and right, everybody. So, but if you look into the roots, what was the uniting base? We discovered our identity, and as I described, we went through from zero identity, from the life where Jew means nothing except from anti-Semitism. There was nothing positive in it. And suddenly you discover that that's, if you only will choose it, you'll have such unique history, and you'll have this family of people who, exactly as you just now said, my father and your father are from the same place, we are one family. And you can have the state, this unique state, startup nation on your side. And on the other hand, many American Jews, those whom I was meeting, you came when I was already in prison, so you met my mother, but I met hundreds and hundreds of Jews, and they were describing their stories. And you see how they rediscover their identity. They, in their daily life of successful Americans, suddenly find out how good it is to feel yourself part of the family, part of the history, and be active in this history. And that was this like mutual rediscovery of different groups of Jews of their own identity. And this feeling that we are one family was so revealing, so good, and it was more important than our differences. So today what I'm saying, it is so important. The only thing which can unite us in the struggle against left and right anti-Semitism, in feeling solidarity with Israel, even when you strongly disagree with the government, or feeling solidarity with American Jewry, even if you're so angry how they are disappearing, assimilating, how their identity is becoming thinner and thinner, that what is above this is our mutual desire. In the end, when you ask any minister during all very strong debates about one or another project for world Jewry, the moment you ask, but do you really want that Israel will be home for all the Jews of the world? Everybody feels very strongly, yes, of course. And the many Jews in diaspora who are very angry, disagree on this policy and this policy and this policy with the Israeli government, But do you really want to be part of Jewish journey together with the Jewish one? Of course. So those who don't want, for whom it is not really important, nothing can be done. But you can see again and again how so many Jews who seem to be absolutely lost for their people. They are coming to birthright trip for 10 days. And suddenly they discover that it's cool, that it's interesting to be part of this family, of this debate which is going. So the first thing is not how to convince these Jews to be active in the struggle for anti-Semitism. The first thing is how to give them this feeling, how much more interesting, much more rich life can be if you feel yourself part of this history and of this family. And then based on this feeling, you're trying to build our mutual struggle.
That key sense of patriotism and identity is so important. I think and the birthright link is very interesting. One of the things I notice on campus is when you speak to a group of engaged Jews, many of them are Orthodox. Many of them, as you were pointing out, Charles, implicitly in your language, have Russian-sounding names, and many of them have Israeli-sounding names. But the classic, what we think of as American Jew, the second and third and fourth generation great-great-grandson or great-great-granddaughter of the immigrant is increasingly erased, increasingly disappeared, and they need that sort of jolt if they're lucky enough to come on Birthright or some other program of Israel to bring them back. And that's a massive failure, not of the students, but of their parents. That's a massive failure of our institutions to give them that sense of patriotism, give them that sense of citizenship. I'm not going to be able to get beyond my hatred of you because you're thinking wrong if I don't have a core sense of that kind of commitment that Natan's talking about something greater, which is that sense of a dialogue to be a part of this Jewish people. Until we have that sense of peoplehood, until we have that sense of solidarity, I have zero tolerance for your daring to disagree with me, because we're in this culture of cancellation and of polarization and of partisanship. So that's one thought. The second thing is let's be a little controversial. Right now in the United States of America, we're finishing a very difficult summer and entering a very difficult fall, where the whole question of Black Lives Matter is very delicate on two levels. One, it's very clear that there's a massive feeling among many Americans and certainly among American Jews that there's a serious racial problem in this country, in the United States of America, that needs to be dealt with. And that's very important. I'm not criticizing that at all. But it's no news to anybody on this call that there are elements of the Black Lives Matter movement that have flirted with, and more than flirted with, are deeply not just anti-Zionist, but anti-Semitic. And how we as a community deal with that, what red lines we set with that, is very important. That's easy on a certain level because that's kind of obvious. The harder question is this. Wired into the whole conversation of social justice warriors, of wokeness, of anti-racism, is a vision of America and a vision of the West that is not only deeply un-American and in some ways anti-American, but also deeply un-Jewish and anti-Jewish. And to the extent that we, over the course of the summer, received emails from the most establishment of establishment Jewish organizations, just passing on the latest, most cliche, most mainstream interpretations of this anti-racism, this social justice. Again, and I'm for the goals, but the way they're often expressed are often done in a way that is toxic to the immigrant story that is so central to American Jews feeling good about themselves. That's toxic to a notion of individualism, and toxic, most important of all, to a notion of true tikkun olam, which is redemption. Because if America is irredeemably racist, if the West is only colonialist and imperialist and racist and can't be fixed, then we're in trouble. And so we really have to go on to a deep dive and look at some of the underlying intellectual and ideological structures that, I'm sorry to say, many in the Jewish community are just absorbing and just breathing in and just accepting out of the goodness of their heart, out of a sincere and earnest desire to fight the evil of racism, that ultimately is going to be toxic not only to our long-term Jewish identity and patriotism, but also to the fight against anti-Semitism, because it's coming in through the back door and coming in a very insidious way. And it's a hard enemy to fight because, again, it's wrapped in love, and it's wrapped in and it's wrapped in all these other things, but it's there.
So, Gil, I have a quick question to ask you. I know, so you're, I think, in a unique position because you spent a lot of time in Israel, you're in Jerusalem, you teach at McGill, and you're a scholar of American history, and you're from the United States originally. Do you see a difference between American Jewry and Canadian Jewry? Is there a significant difference between the two communities?
So first of all, we'll have to work through all my identity issues and my traveling issues and group therapy afterwards. Everybody's invited. Absolutely. There was a poll actually that came out last year, which looked at the nature of Canadian Jewry. And it was kind of a parallel to the Pew study, the famous Pew study that looked at American Jewry and Israeli Jewry. And one of the things they found was the intensity of, again, this peoplehood sense, the intensity of a connection to Israel, the intensity of a Jewish literacy, the intensity of a sense of community, especially in Montreal and in Toronto, which are the two urban centers of Canadian Jewry and where most Canadian Jews live. It's much harder out in the West, in smaller communities, to have it. And you saw a huge difference. And you saw that it's a cycle that builds and builds. It starts with the parents. It continues with Jewish education. It goes through camp. It's what Natan liked to talk about, the identity building spiral when he was in the Jewish Agency. And you see that Canadian Jews live it in a much more profound way than many American Jews. And so Canadian Jews are much more Mexican, much more Australian, much more British, much more French than American Jews, who are uniquely in many ways American. And that's the challenge. And one of the challenges in the book we try to address is, how do you trigger a dialogue between Israeli Jews who have that deep sense of identity, that deep sense of patriotism, but sometimes feel uncomfortable with the religious expressions, and American Jews who are most comfortable talking about their Jewish identity in religious terms, even if they're irreligious, but don't have that national connection. And to the extent that we can learn from one another, and we see this happen on Birthright, on Masa, and some of the programs that Natan initiated under the Jewish Agency, the better off we are. So it's a very complicated issue. American Jews, and I say this as an American Jew, as a New Yorker, we look down on everybody else, except maybe Israeli Jews. We feel a little inadequate vis-a-vis them, but we look at Canadian, Canada is not really a country and merely a suburb of America. I can say this having paid taxes in all three jurisdictions. I can say we wherever I like. But actually, American Jewry has a lot to learn from Canada, from Australia, from England, from South America. Extraordinary Jewish communities there.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question, I think, which relates to what you were just saying. So I find it also fascinating in the United States. So of course, the Jewish people were victims of Nazism and exterminated because of racist ideologies that perceived Jews as non-white. And now Jews, I think in some sense, particularly in the US, are beginning to identify in this generation as white. And of course, the Nation of Islam and the anti-Semitic elements in the Black Lives Matter are labeling the Jewish people as white and privileged. And I think that is putting off, for good reasons, some members of the Jewish community to engage in fighting racism, systemic racism in the United States, and staying away from this movement, feeling very uncomfortable. And I think in a way, this vacuum that is being created by the Nation of Islam and radicals that blame the Jews as being white privileged, that blame Israel for teaching American police techniques that harm African-American men in the United States, all those tropes that were created by the Nation of Islam and the extreme element of the Black Lives Matter, which, Gil, as you said, was anti-Semitic and anti-Israel, anti-Zionist. So these things are being played out, and I think in a way the Jewish community is being pushed and pulled. So how, and at the same time, the question is, people like Linda Sarsour and Black Lives Matter, I think, are doing an amazing job of pushing themselves into this Black Lives Matter struggle against racism, and also marginalizing the Jewish community as white, privileged, and Zionist and racist. So how, is this a very, Natan, I know you're concerned about sort of the rise of Marxism and groupthink. Is this a real threat, kind of a grassroots threat of anti-Semitism within the anti-racist movement? Do you see that as a greater threat than right-wing anti-Semitism? So the Jewish community is sort of in the middle of this fragmented time in the United States. What is the greatest threat, and how can the Jewish community effectively engage in a good way for both society and the community?
Yes, it is a serious threat. What exactly is a serious threat? Now, Marxism was very good in presenting all the history in a very primitive way. It is a fight between oppressors and oppressed. That oppressors were those who were slave owners, feudal owners, then capitalists, and oppressed, of course, were poor people in different, at this moment, the proletarian. And all those who are oppressors, they are always wrong. They are on the wrong side of history. And that's why, by the way, they could be killed as class. And those who are oppressed, they are always right. So now we are in the new world, thank God, in the free world. But look, where all the, and the struggle against racism is a sacred thing. Of course, without any cynicism, I think it's one of the most important things to fight against hatred towards people because of their race or the color of their skin. But in all this multiculturalism, in all this modern world, how it is now presented, it is the struggle of oppressors, white males, against oppressed. And why oppressors are always wrong. And of course, oppressed are right in their struggle. And that's why you Jews who are white, who have white privileges, you are wrong from the beginning. You're coming from the wrong place. So first of all, recognize that you're in the wrong place, and then accept our just demands to help to the oppressed people and oppressed people who are, it is black, it is gays, it's Palestinians. And by the way, and I'm for the rights of all of them. But and then we Jews, what we start saying, we said, oh, God forbid, we are not white. Look, we have Jews from Morocco and we have 60% of Ashkenazi. I don't think we have to go in this debate at all. But so, because the moment they say, no, we are not all white, it means that we already accept that if you're white, you're guilty, you're suspicious and so on. That white racists, they're those who are guilty. And by the way, black racists also are guilty. So that's why I think the very approach, what our opponents really succeeded, they succeeded to create categories of people who are guilty by having this privilege of having of being white. And well, again, it doesn't help to the real struggle against racism. To the contrary, it puts big groups of people, and no doubt that overwhelmingly, Jews, because of their history and because of their tradition, because of the values, of course, they are the best allies of the struggle against racism. But people like Linda Sarsour, who have very different agenda, they say, no, if you want to join our struggle, you cannot be in the march of the women if you don't condemn Israel, if you are not against a Zionist entity, as she says. Why? Because the freedom of Palestinian women is inseparable from the struggle for the rights of the women. And nobody even tries to say to her, wait, you are from Palestine. Where are Palestinian women killed as part of honored killing? Well, I don't have to go into the statistics of the status of women in Israeli society and Palestinian society, and the importance of fighting for the rights of women in the Muslim world, for sure. So I think the fact that we feeling guilty by association or accepting kind of guilt and trying to say, no, we are really, we are not really all white. Don't think that we are missing the point. We should not make any compromise in justified struggle for the rights of women, for the rights of gays, for the rights of black people. We should not permit it to turn into Jew or Israeli hatred, or to connect it in an indirect way with other hatreds.
As an academic, I can't help resist, I can't resist pointing out that look at this conversation. We keep on jumping back and forth between identity and freedom, between the fight for internal pride and the fight for external rights against anti-Semitism. And that's one of the keys to what you do, and of course, one of the keys to the book. Look, we also complain in the book, why is it that back in the day, when it was cool to be white, Jews weren't white? And now that it's not cool to be white, suddenly Jews are white, right? But this white privilege thing, I agree with Natan, it's like a dumb bullet shot at the heart of the American Jew, because it plays into, we're very good at feeling guilty. We're very good at playing this politics of grievance. And so it's not only that it hits us and says, oh, good, oh, look at all the privilege you have, but it continues to explode. That's what dumb bullets do. They explode inside, ripping out the organs and saying that in a sense, we have no voice, and that Israel is this bastion of privilege when we know the story of Israel. And of course, as a result, we're blocked at the intersection, right? Where intersectionality, all these ideas have a kernel of great insight, right? There is an issue in the United States of America. It's different walking around with white skin and dark skin. But to turn it into white privilege and then say that everybody, as Natan points out, is the same is an evil form of old-fashioned Marxism and groupthink. Similarly, to say, yeah, there's intersectionality. Everyone who suffers from the trauma of discrimination shares a common language, but also has a unique thing, that makes sense. But then why are we blocked at the intersection? But also, I don't want to be such a negative Nelly. I want to point out two very positive things that have come through effective activism that you guys represent. One, we talk about in the book about the Women's March. And we talk about Linda Sarsour, but we also talk about how in 2019, Alyssa Milano, the Melrose Place actress who wasn't Jewish, and Deborah Messing, the Will and Grace star, said, hey, wait a minute. We are passionately anti-Trump. We are passionately pro-women, but we're also against discrimination of all kind, and we will not ally with those few African-American women and those few Palestinian women who are trying to hijack this movement and make it anti-Semitic. And Milano said, anytime that there's any bigotry or anti-Semitism, it needs to be called out and addressed. I'm disappointed in the leadership of the Women's March that they haven't done it adequately. And they pulled the Women's March. In 2017, people were so traumatized by Trump's inauguration that there were leaders of the Jewish community who said, no, we have to put our fears aside, we have to put our critique aside, and we have to march with them. That was a terrible mistake. Milano and Messing taught us something very profound. Zero tolerance for all forms of bigotry, zero tolerance for anti-Semitism, whether it comes from the left or from the right. And Black Lives Matter. In 2016, their platform, which is about domestic policy, all of a sudden decides it has to have a foreign policy of one issue, calling out Israel as, quote unquote, I even hate using the word, genocidal. In 2020, the platform doesn't address that. And when you go on the internet, as I did, to try to find the actual initial wording, they've taken down the platform in many, many places. And that shows that when we have a backbone, right? It's not only Pilates Judaism, but it's also spinal Judaism. When we have a backbone, when we say, Ad Kan, red line, this is unacceptable to us. Not everybody listens, but some people, we can find allies in the African-American community, in the women's community, and we reject this false choice that so many of my students have had to say of, oh, I have to be a woman, a feminist or a Zionist. I have to be involved in the gay community or a Zionist. I have to be pro the fight against racism or a Zionist. No, we are talking about true intersectionality, which is, as Natan said, fighting racism, bigotry, intolerance in all its forms.
Well said. And also, just in my work, I look at the social construction of identities, and the notion of race, particularly in the United States, is not so old. It's a few centuries. And Jewish identity predates this sort of binary view of identity. So we have a lot of wisdom and a great source of wealth to draw upon in terms of our own identity. And I think also to understand that Jews have always been defined by different forces, and there's sort of power in defining. When you're able to define the other, you have power. And I think we have to sort of dig deep and make sure that we're defining ourselves in the way that we want to as Jewish people.
That's why we call anti-Semitism, we build on Robert Wistrich's notion of anti-Semitism being the longest hatred. We also call it the most plastic hatred. because it's manipulated, it's moved around to fit whatever form the haters want, and of course it's also artificial and toxic.
Yeah. So we were supposed to stop. We're supposed to stop in a minute or two. We have one question I'd like to ask you from Joel Sheridan from Netanya, and he says on fear that you, Troy, and Sharansky suggest that we are now witnessing a new phenomenon in the United States that could be possibly described as a form of fascism within democracy, or the oxymoron of democratic fascism. Could you please expand on his point?
Well, I mean,
Gil, please.
So
because I don't know what he means. He didn't explain us what he means.
It goes back to the Cato poll, that we, in the same way that we resist this idiotic debate about whether anti-Semitism is worse from the left or from the right, we also resist the debate, the idiotic debate about whether totalitarianism and cancel culture is bad if it comes from the left or from the right. And one of the things you saw in the poll, and one of the things we see, is that on the far right, there is a kind of bullying totalitarianism which doesn't brook any opposition, doesn't brook any criticism. And of course, on the far left, there is this, people tend to link the cancel culture to the far left, that also doesn't brook any dissent. And so the scary thing is that it's, as we said, that it's coming up, it's bubbling up. And obviously a lot of this has to do with the way the internet has been hijacked. If you remember, go back to 2000, there were these manifestos, again, that lovely word, about how the internet was going to open up democracy and be this place that would bring out tolerance and kumbaya. By the way, there were similar articles written and manifestos written in the 1930s and 40s and 50s about how television would take away the superficiality from American politics and bring it back to substance. And unfortunately, we've seen how much of social media is used for the opposite, for bullying. And the right is as adept at bullying on social media as the left is. And but what I continually see, and again, because I'm an optimist and Natan is an optimist too, a perennial optimist, is I call this the silenced majority, that we give so much room and so much power to the shrill extremists on the left, on the right. We do it also in the Jewish community. The few Jews who denounce Israel lead us all to pull our hair out, if we had any, to say, oh my goodness, the American Jewry has abandoned Israel. Look at the polls. The polls show that 78% of American Jews continue to support the state of Israel. And so we have to be careful that we don't allow the shrill bullying voices, which some people choose to use the word fascist for. I find that an unhelpful word, to dominate. But there is a problem in that, and it goes back to the politics of fear and the politics of bullying, and that's something that we have to stand very strong against, regardless of who wins the election in November.
I want to add, I really don't know what our friend from Netanya really means when he speaks about fascist democracy. But I want to take it to mainstream, not to the margins, because these voices of the warning we can hear from the left and from the right. From the left, we hear more and more, of course, about Trump and Trump's administration, and look how intolerant he is, and step by step, other Republicans stop criticizing, and because they're afraid not to succeed in their elections, they support Trump on everything, and they say, isn't it awful, isn't it dictatorial, and so on. That's what I hear very often from the left, and maybe that's what was meant. On the other hand, just now we could see the letter of 150 people of culture, some of them from the right, most of them are on the left, and some of them are from the extreme left, who are warning about this dangerous situation when people, if they don't show themselves enough on the left, or when they permit to publish the opinion of somebody on the right, can lose their jobs. And of course, the best example is in New York Times, dared to publish the article of one senator, right-wing senator, who supported President Trump, and the head of op-ed page had to resign, famous, very liberal person. So, and they say, you see, that's the real non-democratic situation is happening on the left. And so I don't know from which direction the question was asked, but I think this cancel culture, the culture of refusing to hear the voices of the other side is extremely dangerous situation. And we in our book speak a lot against it.
Yeah. To me, that's the most frightening part of what's happening, particularly in the United States. If you don't.
But that's, I have to say, that doesn't depend on people on the top. That doesn't depend on the Trump or Biden. That depends on each of us, whether we decide that because of our consideration of career or popularity or keeping our friendship, we will stop expressing our views. And if we'll stop expressing our views, yes, it will be fair society.
So on that note, on that very important note, I want to thank you both, Natan and Gil, for an excellent book. I recommend it, and I hope people watching will purchase it. We sent the URL around. You can buy it on Amazon. And I think it's a very important and timely book at many levels. So mazel tov on the book. And we should all have a happy and successful and peaceful, healthy new year. Yeah. And really thank you for all that you're doing. And just to let you know, this will be recorded, and we're going to put it on our website within a few hours so people can watch it at their leisure and send it to family and friends. So
thank you. Thank you everybody.
Shana tova.
Baruch Toda.